November 29, 1943, more than 300 B-7 flying fortresses crossed into German airspace heading for Bremen. One of them was a bomber called Ricky Tick Tavi. Inside its tail, a 19-year-old staff sergeant named Eugene Moran sat on his knees behind twin 50 caliber machine guns. "Get your cameras, boys. I'm going to light it up like Christmas. Pilot the bomber, your ship." Ricky Tick Tavi was on its fourth mission. By the time the bombs were dropped, it was already falling behind the formation. Alone in the sky, it became the only target. German fighters came in waves. Bf-100s fired rockets into the fuselage. Then Bf-19s and FW-19s closed in from every angle. Moran fired back from the tail. One by one, the voices on the intercom went silent. 8 of the 10 crew members were dead. The navigator bilayed out from the front. Moran was the only man left alive inside the aircraft. Then a German flak round hit the fuselage and split the bomber in two. The front section with the wings and engines dropped away. The tail, a 12T piece of aluminum with no wings, no engine and no controls, kept moving, and Moran was still inside it. He tried to open the escape hatch. Bent metal held it shut. His parachute was damaged. There was no way out. The tail section began to fall. 4 miles below was the German countryside. Moran had no way to slow down, no way to steer, no way to jump. He was locked inside a piece of wreckage, dropping through 28,000 ft of open sky. And then he did something that should not have been possible, but that comes later. To understand how man ends up alone inside a falling piece of airplane, you have to understand the position he was assigned to. The tail gunner on a B-7 occupied a space that most people would not willingly enter on. The ground, let alone at 5 mi above the earth in minus 60 degrees with German fighters behind him. It was the most isolated crew position on any Allied bomber. The tail gunner could not see the rest of his crew. He could not reach them. He could not touch another human being for the entire mission. The only way in or out was a narrow crawl through the fuselage, past the waist guns, past the ball turret, over the bomb bay catwalk. Once inside, the gunner was sealed off from everything except whatever was coming from behind. The tail gunner was the last crew member who could evacuate if the plane went down. Everyone else was closer to an exit. He had to crawl the full length of the fuselage just to reach a hatch. And in combat music, that crawl was often the difference between getting out and going down with the aircraft. The position that killed them was about the size of a phone booth. To reach the tail of a B-7, a gunner had to crawl through the entire length of the aircraft. He started behind the cockpit, squeezed past the radio room, crossed a narrow catwalk over the open bomb bay, 9 in wide with nothing below but the bay doors and a long drop, then pushed through the waist gun section where 2 gunners stood at open windows, and finally ducked into a tunnel that led to the tail compartment. The space waiting for him was roughly 4 ft wide. There was no chair. Instead, the gunner knelt on the floor and leaned against a small bicycle seat that took part of his weight. His legs folded beneath him, his knees pressed against the metal. In front of his face sat 2 M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, each loaded with 565 rounds of ammunition. The guns weighed 64 lb each. The barrels pointed backward through a small opening covered in plexiglass. That plexiglass was the only thing between the gunner and the sky behind the plane. It was not armor. A 20 cannon round would go through it without slowing down. The tail gunner had no room to stand. If he was over 510, his helmet scraped the ceiling. His shoulders' music brushed the sides. Every piece of equipment, oxygen hose, intercom cable, heated suit wiring, parachute harness, crowded the space further. The parachute itself was too bulky to wear. It was stored nearby, within arm's reach in theory, though in practice reaching it under fire was another matter entirely. Once in position, the gunner was completely cut off. He could not see a single member of his crew. The nearest man, the closest, waist gunner, was music, more than 20 ft forward around a bend in the fuselage, invisible behind equipment and ammunition boxes. Communication existed through the intercom and nothing else. If the intercom failed, the tail gunner had no way of knowing what was happening to the rest of the aircraft. Ken Tucker, a tail gunner with the 15th Air Force, flew 35 missions in the B17 II out of FOA, Italy. To reach his position, he crawled through the same tunnel on every mission, eased himself down onto the bicycle seat, and plugged. In his oxygen mask and heated suit, Tucker described himself as a loner. The isolation did not bother him. He felt comfortable in the tail. His first combat mission was not with his own crew. Standard practice sent rookie gunners up with experienced crews for their first time over enemy territory. Tucker flew with strangers to Munich. He had never seen combat. He questioned whether he was ready. As the formation crossed the Alps and approached the target, the sky filled with flak bursts, thousands of black puffs of shrapnel exploding at altitude, each one throwing hot metal in every direction. Tucker survived that mission. He would survive 34 more, but comfort in the tail was a relative term. The isolation that suited a loner also meant something else. If the aircraft was hit, if the oxygen line was cut, if the heating failed, the tail gunner dealt with it alone. No one was coming to help him. The rest of the crew was too far away, the fuselage too narrow, the equipment too dense. In an emergency, the tail gunner's first instinct could not be to call for assistance. It had to be to fix the problem himself with numb fingers in the dark at 25,000 ft. And at that altitude, the cold was not just discomfort. It was a weapon of its own. The B-7 was designed to fly at 25 to 30,000 ft. At that altitude, the outside air temperature dropped to -50 or -60 degrees if the aircraft was not pressurized. It was not heated. The fuselage was an aluminum tube with open gun ports in the waist section, where wind blasted through. At 180 mph. In the tail, the plexiglass panel behind the guns offered some protection from the slipstream, but none from the cold. The temperature inside the tail compartment was essentially the same as outside. At -60, exposed skin freezes in under a minute. Metal becomes dangerous to touch. Bare flesh bonds to it instantly. A gunner who pulled off his glove to clear a jammed weapon had seconds before frostbite began. The 50 caliber Brownings jammed regularly. Clearing a jam required manipulating the charging handle, feeding the ammunition belt back into the receiver, and sometimes physically pulling a spent casing free. All of this demanded bare fingers, or at best thin silk glove liners. Every jam was a race between the malfunction and the cold. The solution was the electrically heated flight suit, a one-piece coverall with thin wires sewn into the fabric, connected to the aircraft's electrical system through a plug in the fuselage wall. General Electric had developed the technology. The engineering came from an unlikely source, electric blankets. Before the war, GE had built a device called the Copper Man, a mannequin used to test heated bedding. The same wiring principles were adapted for flight suits, gloves, and boot insoles. In theory, the system kept a crew member warm enough to function at altitude. In practice, it was unreliable. The wires were fragile. Body movement bent and broke them. A single broken connection could shut down heating to an entire limb. Damaged wires did not just stop working. They could short-circuit and burn the wearer. The temperature controls were crude. Some men overheated until they were drenched in sweat, which then froze when the suit failed. Others felt nothing at all. In 1943, up to 75% of frostbite cases among bomber crews were caused by failures in the electric flight suits. Not by exposure music, not by forgetting to dress properly, by equipment that stopped working at the worst possible moment. Ken Tucker flew his missions out of FOIA and described the cold at altitude as constant and inescapable. The heated suits improved over the course of the war. Later models had better wiring and adjustable temperature controls, but they never became fully reliable. On missions lasting 10 or 12 hours, a suit failure at the halfway point meant hours of exposure with no alternative. The tail gunner had it worse than most. The waist gunners at least had each other. If one man's suit failed, his partner could see it and help. The ball turret gunner was cramped but enclosed. The pilot and co-pilot sat in the most insulated section of the aircraft. The tail gunner was alone. If his suit failed, no one knew. If his oxygen line iced over and the flow stopped, no one would notice until someone tried to call him on the intercom and got no answer. By then, at that altitude, he would already be unconscious. The cold could kill a man quietly, but German fighters were not quiet at all, and they had a very specific reason to aim for the tail first. The story of why German fighters targeted the tail first is also the story of how the tail gunner changed aerial combat over Europe. If you want to see how that played out and what happened when the Luftwaffe found a way around it, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Now back to 1942. When American heavy bombers first appeared over occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe attacked them from behind. It was the logical approach. A fighter closing from the rear matched the bomber's direction of travel, which meant a low closing speed and more time to aim.